Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks for being with us today. And it is my pleasure to feature a great emerging historian out in the Shenandoah Valley. Mike Gionfriddo is a park ranger with the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. Mike, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Chris. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to speak to you guys.
It's a distinct pleasure for me. For folks who can see the video, you're sitting in a nice plush leather or faux leather chair there. You're looking super comfy.
Faux leather,
Yeah.
definitely.
So I wanted to ask Mike to just spend some time with us to talk a little bit about the battlefields in the Shenandoah Valley. Specifically, in this episode, we're going to focus on the 1862 battlefields because I've been spending a lot of time on them recently, and then we'll get him to come back and talk about the 64 Valley battlefields for folks who are fans of Jubal Early and Phil Sheridan. I would not be a Phil Sheridan fan, as most folks here know. But I am a Jackson fan, so let's talk 1862. First of all, just tell me a little bit about the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation and the work that you guys do, kind of helping to manage so many different puzzle pieces out there.
Yeah, so I work with the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. We're the managing entity of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District. This was a district that was created by Congress in the late 1990s. So we were created as a private organization, but we are the managing entity of this National Historic District. So what we do is we preserve, we manage, and we interpret our Civil War sites here in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. So that includes preserving battlefield grounds, buildings associated with the American Civil War, and then not only just preserving those locations for future generations, but also maintaining them so that they can stay around for those future generations, opening up museums and visitor centers, and then adding interpretation on the field, not just in the form of wayside markers, monuments, cannons, and restoring fence lines, but also in the way of education programs, field trips, a lot of different facets the foundation works at. So that's one of my favorite aspects of working with the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation is I wake up every single day and there's something different going on. You really don't get bored working in a spot like the Shenandoah Valley here, especially with the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation.
I'd have trouble getting anything done because it's so pretty out there. I'd just be
It
looking out my
is.
window the whole time.
Seriously, your commute to any of our locations is gorgeous. We have five museums and visitor centers, closing in on 8,000 acres of preserved land here in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. So there's a lot of stuff to check out that's preserved by the Battlefields Foundation, and not only just preserved by SVBF, but also preserved by our partner organizations as well.
Now, when you talk about the Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Historic District,
Mhm.
explain to folks kind of what are the boundaries of that area?
So that encompasses Frederick County, Warren County, Clark County, Shenandoah County, Page County, Rockingham County, Augusta County, and Highland County here in Virginia. Although our district is working to expand right now into West Virginia, Jefferson County, Morgan County, Berkeley County. Hopefully, will be joining our district sometime soon. Now, the Shenandoah Valley itself is contained between the Blue Ridge Mountains on the east and the Allegheny Mountains on the west. So our district is within the counties that kind of make up in between those two mountains right there, where a good chunk of the Civil War action took place. So, like I said, those eight counties here in Virginia.
Because to me, it's been pretty incredible. Having gone out to the McDowell battlefield, and you guys have like a presence out there and visitor
Yeah.
services available. And then in Winchester, of course, a huge presence, a great museum. And so it's like everywhere I turn, you guys have a stamp that's really kind of pulling all of this stuff together. So, like logistically, it's got to be a challenge to just wrangle so many cats over so many acres.
It is, and especially if you know the foundation, we've got a pretty small staff. I mean, they all could fit comfortably in this room right here in my apartment, which is not a big apartment, if I have to say so. So I mean, everybody, like I said, wears multiple hats on each on the jobs. We've got a great staff though, from Kevin Walker, who is the CEO of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. He's a great role model to work under. Just absolutely Energizer Bunny. Dan Reinhardt, he works as the chief operating officer for the Battlefields Foundation. Another great individual to work under, another great role model for somebody who's younger like myself, kind of sinking their teeth here in the public history field. But I'm not the only one who's in my position, being a younger fellow here in the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, working with public history. My colleague Jack Owens, he's our land projects manager, just turned 25 about a month ago. So the foundation has done a great job at getting people like me, younger people, those opportunities to like I said, sink their teeth into public history here. And like you said, there's we are a very expansive foundation. There's a lot of things that we maintain here. So, like I was saying earlier, every single day I'm going to do something different on every day I wake up on the job site. So it takes a lot of work, but all hands on deck. We're all super passionate about what we do here, and that's a big, like I said, marching drum of what we do.
Uh, Let me ask you real quick too about the museums because you mentioned you have several museums. They offer a lot of different experiences, and
Yes.
for folks who are coming to the valley and they kind of want to see some stuff, the museums really offer good opportunity for that. Give us just a quick little checklist and highlight of where folks might visit.
So,
I don't mean to put you on the spot if you don't have your
no, you're
checklist in
good.
front of you.
No, you're good. You're good. We'll start on the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley, the lower valley. In Winchester, there's the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum, which is located in the 1840 Winchester Frederick County Courthouse. That is a crown jewel of Civil War history, not just for Winchester, but for the whole Shenandoah Valley. The exhibit area upstairs is an award-winning exhibit area. New artifacts are being added to that exhibit area in the next few months as well. Within the last month, we added the headquarters flag of Colonel Joseph Thoburn, the 1st Division of the Army of West Virginia. Some new uniforms and flags will be added in the exhibit area soon, like I was mentioning. But that's, I would say, the number one site to go visit. If you're going to see a Civil War destination here in the Valley, Winchester's a great location. You have 6 different major battles that took place there in the city, 72 different occupations, and the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum, the 1840 Winchester Frederick County Courthouse. It stands right there in the center of all that action that happens in and around the city. And then throughout all of those different 72 occupations, 6 major battles, the building would be used as a field hospital, a prison cell, a barracks. It was a recruitment office early on in the war. Some of the companies that make up the Stonewall Brigade actually enlist right there in the site. And then it serves as a rallying point. We'll get to this, I'm sure, a little bit later, but that's a pivotal location where part of the most famous action from the First Battle of Winchester takes place. So that's a crown jewel of Civil War history. Great spot to start your Civil War travels here in the Shenandoah Valley. And then the exhibit area upstairs encompasses all the major Civil War action here in the Valley. It presents it on a timeline, starting with the raid at Harper's Ferry, going through Jackson's Valley Campaign, 1862, 1863, the home front, the Gettysburg Campaign, which, yes, does go through the Shenandoah Valley here, Second Battle of Winchester, and then into 1864, the back and forth here in the Valley, the ending of the war, and then into Reconstruction. So that exhibit area, amazing. We've done a lot of work on that in the last few years, and more work is being added to really add some jaw-dropping artifacts into the exhibit area soon. And then right here in town, if you go to the 3rd Winchester Battlefield Park, there is the Winchester Battlefields Visitor Center located at the main entrance to the battlefield. That is another great location. That will interpret the 6 major battles that took place here in Winchester throughout the war. So that includes 1st Kernstown, 1st Winchester, 2nd Winchester, Rutherford's Farm, 2nd Kernstown, and 3rd Winchester. It's got a digital battle map there, state of the art, projects the troop movements down from the ceiling. If you haven't checked it out yet, 100% go and see that. And then if you continue further south in the Shenandoah Valley, further up the valley, eventually you'll get to Newmarket. Right there in Newmarket, we have the historic Strayer House. Historic Strayer House serves as the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation's administrative offices. But downstairs, there's a great coffee house, the Jackson Corner Cafe, and then there's also free exhibit areas for you guys to check out, and that will, display some artifacts associated with the Battle of Newmarket. And like I said, that's another visitor services location that we offer. If you're going to see Newmarket, I always recommend going to check out that location because there's the ties to the Civil War history outside of the 1864 Battle of Newmarket with that building. And then on top of that, it does interpret some of the fighting in the downtown area pretty well, which you drive up and down 81, you see what's west of 81 there at Newmarket, the museums, the battlefield itself, the cannons, the monuments, the fence lines. It's pretty enticing to look that way when it comes to the battlefield, but 81 stretches right through where the combat zone was. So if you look east of 81 in the town of Newmarket, there was some heavy combat down there as well. But if you go to the west side of 81, there is the Newmarket Battlefield Visitor Center and Museum, originally owned by the Bracken family, that was recently purchased by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation a few years ago. And we're at the tail end of our second phase four big phases at really moving into that building, getting the exhibit area, updated so that it's kind of up to the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation standards. And then we've got a lot of fun ideas for that museum, stuff that I'm not going to talk too much about today, but be checking out the foundation's social medias because I'm sure you'll hear about that in the near future. And then if you continue even further up the valley, even further south in the valley, in Port Republic, there's the Port Republic Museum, which is located in the historic Kemper House. That's the building where Turner Ashby's body was laid out in right after he falls at the Battle of Harrisonburg. So definitely worth to go check that out. That will interpret not just the Battle of Port Republic, but that area itself. And then you can go and drive real quickly over to some of our sites right in the area from Cross Keys and Port Republic. So those are the 5 museums and visitor centers maintained by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation right now. But there's also a ton of county and town visitor centers throughout our National Historic District that we maintain an orientation section or an orientation panel within. So if you're in Harrisonburg, the Hardesty Higgins Visitor Center there has an orientation room that's maintained by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. Here in Frederick County, Virginia, the Frederick County Visitors Center right by Shenandoah University has an orientation center for the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. The Highland County Museum out there by McDowell has orientation out there by the Battlefields Foundation as well. So even in locations that are not SVBF owned or SVBF maintained, we have a little bit of, like you said, our stamp in there as well. Just trying to build the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation or Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District as a destination for Civil War enthusiasts. And that's really what I think we're really striving to build right here.
So, Mike, let's shift over to the 1862 battlefield specifically. And you mentioned a couple of them by name there. And I'm really just kind of interested as a guy who spends a lot of time in those battlefields, kind of like what your take is on being out on those fields and what you've discovered and what you've learned and what insights you've gained. Maybe we can kind of walk our way through chronologically and we'll start at McDowell,
Yeah.
which is a hike to get out there. But I think it's well worth the drive for sure. Tell me about your experiences out at McDowell.
Well, with McDowell, and I mean, you get this with every single battlefield. I'm preaching to the choir to anybody who's listening to this, where you can't really understand the battlefield until you go out there and you see the terrain in front of you. And there's always hills on battlefields, but Sitlington's Hill at McDowell, that really is one where, I've been to battlefields and you see some pretty impressive heights, and you're like, wow, trying to take that must have been rough. But you go to where you stand where the Union's advance was, the Union perspective at Sitlington's Hill. It's an impressive position. It's steep slopes that the Confederates are up upon. And I mean, when you talk about these battlefields, there's always one location that not only commands the battlefield, but that's the destination to go out to. And that really is it with McDowell. And not only that, but it becomes a really interesting, you understand that piece of the property better. You can understand a little bit more about what happens at McDowell. That's a position that the Union fears that the Confederates are going to place artillery upon, although Confederates apparently are reportedly not planning to put artillery on those positions. You can see where the Union sits there, and Confederates can put guns up there that can just rip apart the entire Union line on the battlefield there. And then you can see where the sun's setting behind behind the hills, how that would illuminate the Confederate soldiers, their silhouettes atop Sitlington's Hill, which is such, like I said, a loaf-like hill. It is steep. It is right there on the battlefield, and you can see where the Confederates would need to stand up to fire their positions. Standing up would then make their silhouettes a little bit more visible to the Union infantry who's out there on the battlefield. And it does help make sense. Although this is a Confederate victory, the Union the Confederates end up having higher casualty rate or a higher casualty number at that battlefield than the Union Army does, which is, like I said, it's just a really interesting thing. But you understand that position at McDowell a little bit better, and you can understand that battle and that action a little bit better, and why the Confederates ended up walking away with the higher casualties, although they ended up winning that battle right there. But even if you backtrack before McDowell and you go to like First Manassas, I mean, there's a lot of great locations there associated with that battlefield. Properties preserved by the Kernstown Battlefield Association. Pritchard Hill, which is a little less intimidating when you're standing right there in front of it, but you're standing at the Opequon Church by the Kernstown Battlefield. You look across the plain right below Pritchard Hill, and then you see Pritchard Hill in the distance. That too is an impressive position. Sandy Ridge, which is where the battle will eventually shift focus to, another very impressive position. And just by that area is where the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation is currently working to preserve 120 over 120 acres of land right south of the current Rose Hill Park. So we have current preservation efforts there at First Kernstown, and then at McDowell right now we have 138 or 100 or sorry 1,300 acres of preserved land, over 1,300 acres of preserved land, and that goes through the trails at Sittington's Hill as well. So, like I said, with those two opening battles of Jackson's Valley campaign, you have some impressive topographical locations from Pritchard Hill, Sandy Ridge at First Kernstown, and then Sittington's Hill there at McDowell. And that, like you said, it's a hike to get out there to that battlefield. That's the one that I'm probably at the least out of all the 62 battlefields.
Well, yeah, because you get past Churchville and then there's like no cell service.
Yep.
There's nothing when you get out there. So now
You're really going out there.
yeah, well worth the drive though. It's a beautiful drive. So I have tipped my hand, and I think you have tipped your hand. So where do you start the Valley campaign? Because I jumped right to McDowell, and you're like, whoa, let's talk about Kernstown here. So tell me about that.
It's a flexible date. I mean, you could really say when Jackson gets to Winchester is when the Valley campaign begins, because he doesn't sit by idly here when he's in Winchester. All the expeditions into what is today West Virginia, Dam Number 5, Romney expedition, all that fun stuff. That's not Jackson necessarily sitting by idly, and that is stuff that I think will play into the success that he eventually has later in spring of 1862. Now, the formal Valley campaign, I think, really does begin when Jackson evacuates Winchester, March 11th of 1862. He has his famous first and last council of war, and then evacuates Winchester. Banks moves in. Jackson withdraws south to Rude's Hill, the Mount Jackson area, and a few days later is when he receives the faulty intelligence from Turner Ashby that the Union Army is withdrawing out of the Cedar Creek area, withdrawing through Frederick County, Virginia. They're evacuating, and that gives Jackson kind of the let's go for it, and that opens up the real big action here in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley in 1862. And I really do consider First Kernstown to be part of that campaign because, well, you can make those arguments with Romney. With First Kernstown, although it's a tactical defeat for Jackson, it's a strategic victory, and it does raise the little red alert there in Washington, D.C., that this action's going on, that there's this commander moving through the Shenandoah Valley through this knife that is just pointing into the north, and there's troops that start to get pulled away from the Richmond front and from some of those other fronts, and then starting to get dispatched to the Shenandoah Valley. So I think First Kernstown kind of initiates the successes that we associate with Jackson's Valley campaign. Jackson's Valley campaign is not necessarily Jackson scoring all these massive tactical victories. It's the strategic victory as the campaign as a whole. And that really does begin with his threat there at First Kernstown. Although it's a defeat for him on the field that day, the spirits of his army are high. He mentions that writing to his wife just a few days after that battle. And I think the motion that we would eventually associate with the success in Jackson's campaign really does start there in late March with the First Battle of Kernstown.
So I don't have especially strong feelings, although I tend to kind of plug it with his, plug the beginning with his movement across the mountain through Brown's Gap and then out toward McDowell.
Yeah.
Just because, and again, not because of the Kernstown loss. He's like, honestly, and I say this as a Stonewall Jackson fanboy, he's not an especially great tactician during the Valley campaign.
No.
He's got like overwhelming odds in so many cases, and it takes him a long time to win any of those battles. But I sort of think like once Lee gets involved and is like, maybe you should try this because Lee's thinking about that large strategic situation in a conscious way that is sort of triggered by the battle at Kernstown. But like I don't think anybody's explicitly looking at the Valley until that, and then it's like, oh wait, and the whole dynamics change, and so that's kind of why I plug it that way.
And you're right. With McDowell, the dynamic absolutely changes. And when we talk about the Valley campaign, you usually, when you talk about the big victories for Jackson, the tactical victories, you talk about first Winchester, Port Republic. And it seems like recently there's not been as much focus on McDowell, but when that happened, that was a bright light for the Confederacy. This was not a good time for them. New Orleans recently fell. Memphis was poised to fall within the next few weeks. There, and then for the Union Army, Virginia had been a theater they had not been successful at in the Valley. They thought they were going to be successful. They had that victory at Kernstown. And McDowell provides that first little glimmer of kind of the success here in the Valley, but the hope here in the Valley, and the hope that is eventually tied to Stonewall Jackson. So I think, you definitely have a great argument there where McDowell kind of sparks off the whole, what we associate the Valley campaign with, in terms of, where you have Lee kind of getting involved at this point, in terms of kind of putting his arm in what he thinks Jackson should be accomplishing out here in the Valley. But also it sets up that next, formal Union thrust into the Shenandoah Valley. And then, like I said, for what the Valley campaign was, that glimmer of hope for the Confederacy at a time where they really needed it, McDowell was a huge victory that I think we oftentimes overlook because of what happens afterwards with, like I said, first, Front Royal, first Winchester, Cross Keys, Port Republic. But McDowell, when it happened, was an important victory that was, like I said, seen all throughout the South. And it really started to build Jackson, not just as he's this guy who's, the great victor of First Manassas. He's got that cool nickname. Well, there's a lot of cool nicknames in the Civil War. I'm sure if I was there in the Civil War, I'd have a lot cooler nicknames than what I have today. But McDowell is really what kind of starts to build Jackson as, like I said, a glimmer of hope throughout the Confederacy.
Yeah, it turns him from a cool nickname into a hero and a good propaganda tool. I mean, that's I
And
think a huge part of it.
absolutely the reason of why we know Jackson. I always tell people this. It's not just the nickname, or not just the fact that he's mortally wounded and he's shot down, or, at what you can consider to be the height of his career. I'd argue the emotional high point of his career is right here in the Shenandoah Valley. This is the reason why Stonewall Jackson's name is become immortalized.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, so much so that my sister recently recently gave birth. I'm now an uncle for the first time.
Congratulations!
Thank you. My nephew was born on March 23rd this year. She decided to name him Jackson. Now, she might claim he's not named after Stonewall Jackson, but when he's being raised, I'm telling him that's the reason. Just like Jackson said there on March 23rd, we're in for it. This kid's going to be in for it. He's going to be the next generation of Civil War historians. So, like I said, the name Stonewall Jackson still is immortalized in history, not just because it's a cool nickname, not just because of his military prowess in the Civil War, but specifically here in the Shenandoah Valley. This is the campaign that makes him a household name.
So my oldest son is named Jackson after.
Oh, there you
Jackson,
go.
So, yeah. So he marches out to McDowell. He goes, past Monterey's. He's kind of sort of chasing after Fremont's forces. He comes back. What's your impression of just kind of the out and back and the distance involved? And, what kind of impact does that have on the campaign?
You just said the key word right there, the distance involved. And not only that, but the terrain involved there. You mentioned earlier, you drive out to McDowell. It's a beautiful drive, but you also get a good idea of terrain that the armies are marching through out there. And that is some rough ground. I mean, all throughout the Shenandoah Valley, you have some pretty rough ground, but usually if you're jolting north and south, you have the Valley Pike, Route 11. That's a pretty easy route to march an army upon. Whereas Jackson making that movement west into the mountains, then back into the Shenandoah Valley, was a harder route to go through. And like I said, rough terrain. You drive out there in McDowell, even before you get to the battlefield itself, you get an appreciation for what the Union and Confederate forces are going through just by driving through, like I said, that choppy ground, that I wouldn't even want to say undulating terrain, which is a word that a lot of Civil War historians like to use, because it's way more defined than that. It's way more radicalized, those peaks and valleys out there in Highland County.
Yeah, for sure. Like the valley is undulating. Once you get out past Stanton, that's not undulating. That's
No,
uh,
those are peaks and valleys, definitely.
And if folks have ever gone out in that direction, I mean, you sort of cheat yourself if all you do is go into the little village and look at the monuments and the cemetery, which you should do, and you can see things from the federal perspective. But you cheat yourself if you don't make the hike up to the top of Sitlinton's Hill. You guys have a really neat walking trail that goes up there with panels along the way that kind of get you oriented. So, but it's an arduous climb, but I think worth it.
And yeah, I mean, worth it just for the view alone. You get a gorgeous view shed from the top of that from the top of that property or from that trail. But then it also, like you said, gives you an appreciation for just how dominating that position was, how hard it was for the Union soldiers staring down at that position to try and take it. But then for the Confederates, like I was saying, the whole situation with the sunset there on the battlefield, you can easily see where, yeah, you're gonna have to stand up, and the Union's gonna they're down in that plain below you. It's easier for them to kind of hide out in the darkness down there, whereas your shadow is illuminated behind you with the sunset. So it gives you a better appreciation of the combat that happened out there. But then, like you said, it's super rewarding just for the view alone. And it is a stressful hike, one of our more stressful ones here in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. So I haven't done that one as frequently as I've done these other hikes throughout, especially the other 62 battlefields, primarily because it's harder to get out there. But McDowell is a very rewarding battlefield if you make the trek out there. The drive is rewarding. The interpretation is amazing. And then on top of that, the views from the hike, you get a good appreciation for the ground that the soldiers fought upon. But then you also get a great view from that hike that even if you're ever not interested in the American Civil War and the combat and all of that, you can go out there and appreciate the views.
Yeah, and I'll give a little plug to the Highland County Museum out there, where you guys have a visitor contact station as well, and
Yes.
that's in the historic Mansion House, and well worth a little stop there if you get out there during hours where it's open too.
Yeah, definitely well worth the visit to that location. I always say if you're going out to McDowell, make that your first stop, and then that can kind of orient you to where there is to see, what there is to see on the battlefield, best locations to go. You could pick up, maps for the Battlefields Foundation in there, and all of our handout material in there as well.
So Jackson retraces his steps, comes back into the valley, has a little bit of time off. There's a pause before then his big march through New Market Gap or through the, and up to the Ray Valley to Front Royal. Um,
Yeah,
and that's the next action. And he gets there May 23rd. Pretty overwhelming victory over the first Maryland garrison that's there, but takes him a long time. He's got 17-1 odds, and it
yeah.
takes him a while to win, but he does. And it's a kind of a big to do for him. First of all, just what's your impression of the impact of that battle?
Well, the march out there, I think, is what's super impressive. It's not necessarily going back to what we were saying earlier. It's not Jackson tactically his military prowess that makes this campaign so impressive. It's the movements. It's the strategy that Jackson's using. So he'll move his army from the Valley Pike on through the New Market Gap. He'll actually make that turn at in front of the historic Strayer House, which is currently the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation's administrative offices. So that corner where South Congress Street meets over Old Crossroad, Route 11 meets over Old Crossroad, is where Jackson's men made that famous turn around the Strayer House and then into New Market Gap. They then enter the Luray Valley, turn north in Luray Valley. They strike the left because the Union moves south. And once again, we're not going into the full narrative of the tactics here in the campaign, but you have Banks at Strasburg, and then that little Maryland unit under Kenly at Front Royal. Although I should probably do this backwards because it might be mirrored on the computer. And Jackson sets his sights for that Union outpost, the 1,000 soldiers of that 1st Maryland Infantry. And once again, the battle takes him a while to set up, but he just smashes the Union defenses out there. I think they have 900 casualties out of the roughly 1,000 men in the Union Army that are in that engagement. And most of the fighting takes place through the town, up to the hill, up north of town. And there's not much there for visitor sites to go and see. There's not a battlefield hiking tour. But if you go to the entrance of Shenandoah National Park, that's where kind of part of the Confederate advance takes place. This, town of Front Royal, a lot of those buildings were there that witnessed the combat through the streets of town. And then there are some interpretive markers on the northern side of town that interpret some of the fighting, the fairly quick fighting, but the stuff that happened out there. And then Jackson's then the thorn in the side of Banks, and it's now a running fight back to Winchester. And Jackson's going to be right on the heels of Banks as they're trying to withdraw further north, or further down the valley to Winchester for the north.
Yeah. I'll put in a little plug here for our friends with the Civil War Trails. They've got a great little trail that you can follow through Port Royal, Front Royal. Hard to kind of see some of that stuff because it is in the city and it's been all built up and stuff like that. But if you do go there, there are some places you can stop and check things out and see things. And I always like kind of going down between the rivers in that V, which is, to me is just kind of a really neat area to go and explore.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And then Well, like I said, even on top of that, you could just drive to the town. There's the brothers versus brothers marker, which is the interesting story there at Front
Yeah.
Royal. The Maryland versus Maryland units who fight. And I always thought the Maryland versus Maryland rivalry in the Civil War is super interesting. If you go out to Gettysburg, the fight that they have out there at Culp's Hill, then you have another First Maryland that's actually kind of in that area. That's really not in that their part of the fight, but it is out there. So that all kind of gets big there at Front Royal. I mean, that's the big story to talk about there on that battlefield. So, like I said, I always like going to visit those markers, and then the Civil War Trails markers. So I got to plug my laptop back in. The Civil War Trails markers that are throughout the town, and then that are out there on their little trail system that they have north of town.
There are places where you can park and walk out onto the bridges that take you out into the
Mm-hmm.
south and the north forks of the Shenandoah, and I think that's a really neat view and worth doing as well. Again,
Yeah,
stunning to see, but it kind of gives you a really good appreciation of the topography that these rivers create, as far as just a real challenge in some instances.
absolutely, and especially not just in Jackson's Valley campaign, but going into like the Newmarket campaign and even later in 1864. It's easy for us to look at these maps of the whole valley, the 3,000-yard view, and see, oh, well, that's a little blue little line on the map. Why don't they just march right over it? There's got to be somewhere where an army can march over that. If you knock out a bridge, that becomes a lot harder of a piece to cross. I mean, like I said, it's easy for us to look at these maps today as Civil War historians and see, oh, the bridge gets knocked out. Well, how is the pursuit getting is stopping? And you could stand out there, and it could be a short little distance, but getting an idea of what the soldiers have to cross over really does make you appreciate the rivers here in the Shenandoah Valley a little bit more, and it helps you appreciate, like I said, some more of the strategy of taking out those bridges versus keeping them in commission, not just in this campaign, but later on in the fighting here in the Shenandoah Valley. So getting to see those rivers really does help you appreciate what they mean to the strategy and what the movements will ensue, or how the movements will ensue here in the Shenandoah Valley.
Yeah. So after Front Royal, Jackson flushes Banks out of his supply depot in Strasburg, and it's a race to
Yes.
Winchester. And then you end up with the First Battle of Winchester, May 25th. Now, Winchester's got to be an interesting interpretive challenge for you, again, because the city has just radically transformed a lot of the landscape. And then you've got all
Yeah.
these different, I mean, you've got a multitude of battles. Tell me about
And
that.
that's why, going back to what I was saying earlier, if it comes to visitor sites here, going to the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum here in downtown Winchester is a phenomenal location because it's right there in the center of town. So you can kind of just point out where all the fighting takes place around you, and not even getting into the details. It just gives you an idea of when that campaign comes to the city, and then where the fighting takes place. And sadly, a lot of that land has, like you said, been developed over. Winchester is a booming community right now. The Rutherford's Farm battlefield basically completely gone. If you want to stand in the Union battle lines, go shopping at Lowe's. Go first Winchester. There's really not much out there on that battlefield. Completely developed over long before the Battlefields Foundation was enacted. Although there are some really important preservation efforts going on here in Winchester, from the 700 plus acres there the 700 acres at the Third Winchester Battlefield Park, and the roughly 7 miles of hiking trails on that battlefield, all the way to what we're doing right now, actively to preserve land from the Second Battle of Winchester, which is one of the openings of the Gettysburg campaign for the infantry side. We've been able to preserve part of the second day's action where the attack on West Fort took place. We've already preserved Star Fort. That's an open site for the general public. The attack on West Fort site that I just mentioned, that was preserved at the end of last year. And in the near future, you'll see parking areas, trail systems, cannons, restored fence lines, all added to that property, interpretive markers. When the battle ends, just north of town, the Carter Farm, we've been able to save over 160 acres out there as well. So there are battlefield locations that have been preserved that are in the process of soon being opened up as battlefield parks. But sadly, First Winchester lost out on that. Like I said, the Battle of First Winchester is going to take place primarily on two fronts. Jackson and Ewell approach from the from the two roads that approach from the south. So Ewell's troops are approaching on the front Royal Pike. Jackson is advancing on the Valley Pike, and the Union's going to defend two heights south of town: Camp Hill and Bowers Hill. Camp Hill is commanded by Dudley Donnelly's brigade. They're opposed from Ewell's troops. And then on Bowers Hill is where the main Union line is. And that's the big height just south of Winchester. So on May 25th, when the battle begins, Ewell will try and move to take Camp Hill against the Union left, the Confederate right. It's a foggy morning, doesn't really make too many, heavy pushes to try and take that hill. It still remains in Union hands. So Jackson then shifts the focus over onto Bowers Hill, and that's where he'll send out the Stonewall Brigade. He'll send out Tolliver's Virginians, and then he'll eventually bring over Taylor's Louisianians, marching over to the western slope of Bowers Hill and attacking up that slope. It's considered to be what John Worsham referred to as one of the most impressive charges in the American Civil War. And like I said, sadly, if you go to that hillside today, there's not much out there for you to see. Now, where the Frederick County Visitor Center is roughly in the location where some of Ewell and Dudley Donnelly's men would have been fighting, where the Union left, the Confederate right was. We have added an interpretive marker out there towards the end of 2025. But like I said, Bowers Hill, there's really not much out there. Now, if you drive in the community just south of Hanley High School, you get a good idea of the terrain. That's also a north-south facing ridge, so it's hard to defend from troops advancing from the south. And you really can't get that idea when you're out there today because of all the houses and the high school and everything. But if you do go behind the high school, you're in the rough location where the crest of the hill would have been. And you get a good idea that that is a height that commands southern Winchester. And you can see that, you can kind of see the Confederates where they would move around to the western slopes of Bowers Hill. And sadly, like I said, 3 times now, that's a battlefield that's developed over. But if you want to see that battlefield, you can go out there to the Visitor Center. You can go out there to Hanley High School, or you can go out to downtown Winchester. Coming back to the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum, this is a property where part of the First Battle of Winchester took place. And it's also a location that's, I argue, is the emotional high point of Jackson's entire military career. Well, I was saying earlier, the Valley is the reason why we know why Stonewall Jackson's name is immortalized. First Winchester is the victory where it becomes a clear-cut victory in the campaign here. And when Jackson rides through downtown Winchester, he rides right in front of the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum, the old 1840 Winchester Courthouse. He rides right in front of the Taylor Hotel. That's right in front of where the museum is today. So I always tell people, well, yeah, the Battlefield Park, 3rd Winchester is over in that direction. And, Kernstown's over south of us in that direction. You walk right outside, and you're not just, oh, yeah, a battle took place out there. Troops are moving in and out of town. That's where Jackson's rallying his troops after the Battle of First Winchester. There's accounts that some of the civilians, some of the ladies here in town are opening up their windows and taking part in the action. There's accounts that the Union and Confederate lines are 50 yards away from each other, fighting through the streets of Winchester. And like I said, that is the moment for Jackson there in the Valley campaign. He even reflects that that was the scene of entering Winchester, downtown Winchester, was one of the most stirring views or scenes of his entire life. That happens right in the downtown area, right in front of the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum. So if you walk on the famous walking mall here in downtown Winchester, which is part of the Valley Pike, Loudon Street, that has been sectioned off so vehicular traffic doesn't move through. It's like a big sidewalk. If you look up Winchester, Virginia, it's going to be like 5 out of the first 10 Google images that pop up. You walk that walking mall in downtown Winchester where all of those nice shops and restaurants and where the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum is, you're there at the First Winchester Battlefield. Many of the buildings that are down there bore witness to the combat there in the streets and bore witness to Jackson rallying the troops right there in downtown, the emotional high point of his military career. And when Jackson falls mortally wounded, some of the first 2 paintings that are commissioned of him take place at First Winchester, including a painting of Jackson on Bowers Hill and a painting of Jackson in downtown Winchester right in front of the Taylor Hotel, which is just a few doors down from where the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum is. So I always tell people, while that battlefield itself, the ground might not be visible for you to go out there today, you have to drive around the high school. There's the interpretive marker at the County Visitor Center. And if you go to the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum, you're there where the battle ends at. And that's the big part of the battle that is immortalized in paintings and that was talked about by the Confederate soldiers years after the war. So like I said, First Winchester, the battlefield itself, mostly gone, but not in downtown here. You can still see some of the battlefield where the urban combat took place.
And I love the walking mall. A lot of great little restaurants and shops. You can definitely make an afternoon of just spending some time in downtown there for sure. So now then that comes the phase of the campaign people sort of forget about because they just kind of jump down to Cross Keys and Port Republic. But like he drives all the way to Harper's Ferry, threatens the garrison, and then he has that remarkable retreat to Strasburg. It's my favorite part of the campaign because of the superhuman feats of marching marching that particularly the Stonewall Brigade goes through. As a battlefield interpreter, how do you kind of handle that? How do you guide people through that phase of the campaign? What is there to see?
Well, the pressure really is on for Jackson there at that time, because he's starting to get pinched from two sides. Whereas before, he just had to push the threat out of the mountains right here, keep the Union at bay here in the Shenandoah Valley, go and push Banks out of the lower valley. Well, now it's no longer Jackson kind of on the offensive. Now he's on the defensive. Now he's withdrawing up the valley, south in the valley, and he's being pursued by two Union forces. And people overlook, kind of like how people overlook the movement from Front Royal to First Winchester, and even that movement from Newmarket all the way to First Winchester. So a lot of people overlook the retrograde south, back up the valley, that would result in the battles of Harrisonburg, Cross Keys, Port Republic. The Union Army gets very close to the tails of the Confederates out there, especially around like Strasburg. The Union fires from Little North Mountain onto the rear of the Confederate columns as they're retrograding south in the valley. So it's very close combat right there. And like I said, it's hard. Like you said, it's hard marching as well. So you have the Union is on Jackson's tail, but he, once again, like you said, has to make these superhuman marches here in the valley. And that is going to result in the grand finale of his campaign, Harrisonburg, Cross Keys, and Port Republic. But like I said, going back to why this campaign is so important, it's not just the tactical victories, it's the strategy as a whole, from him making these thrusts to these superhuman marches that we read about today. And it's easy for us to drive and you're saying, wow, that must have been a sucky march to make if you were on foot. But then to actually think about it and to look at the terrain and to put yourself into the footsteps of those soldiers. I have not made those marches here in the valley before. I usually do it in my truck, and it's a lot easier than they would have had it. But you get an appreciation for the marching of a Civil War soldier all across, Civil War combat, just from seeing what happens here in the valley. And you get a good idea of why Jackson's so effective. He's able to pull that out of his men where they're able to make that performance, not necessarily on the battlefield itself, but the time in between the battlefields. And I used to play high school hockey. They always told you it's not the games itself, it's how you prepare in between the games. It's what you're doing at practice in between the games. That's kind of like what's happening here in Jackson's Valley campaign. It's not exactly what he does on the field, but how his army is in motion and what they're trying to accomplish in between these battles. So, like I said, that movement from McDowell, eventually all the way from Newmarket to First Winchester, super interesting. And then that retrograde south with Jackson being pressured on either side. He's got a lot, like I said, the Union's right on the tail of the Confederate columns there. The pressure is on, and Jackson's men are making that insane march up the valley.
Yeah. So now, how far do you kind of consider your realm with the foundation going north down the valley from Winchester toward Harper's Ferry? I mean, do you guys have stuff going on up through there?
Well, our current district ends at the state line, Frederick County. Although, like I was saying earlier on the podcast, we are working to expand into West Virginia. Jefferson County, Morgan County, Berkeley County, West Virginia, all just voted to join the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District. So hopefully all goes right there and they get to join the party here. But we also have kind of already started dipping our toes out north of the state line. And we've done preservation efforts at the Hoke's Run battlefield, which is a battle that's before First Manassas. That's a Jackson and Stonewall Brigade battle, even before they earned that famous nickname, that First Manassas, like I said. So a little, a very interesting battle to kind of sink my teeth into there, especially because before I started working at the foundation, before we started this preservation effort at Hoke's Run, I had never even heard of that battle. So to be able to learn a little bit more about it and to get there to the grounds and to see the preservation efforts that both the local community and the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation are doing at that site are really interesting. So we've already started, kind of, like I said, dipping our toes a little bit in the water just north of that state line into West Virginia. And hopefully those three counties to join our district and, like I said, join the party. Even just this past year, our national conference, which we host a national conference every single year. It's usually around April. So if that interests everybody, look at it, because next year we're going to be meeting at Front Royal, and the two battlefields we're going to be dissecting next year will be Fisher's Hill and 3rd Winchester. So those should be really fun. But this past April, last month, Our national conference was held in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and the two battlefields we went and visited were Harper's Ferry and Shepherdstown. So some pretty interesting stuff from the Maryland campaign there, and that's all stuff we're kind of not maybe going gung-ho and preserving locations on, but with those counties eventually hopefully joining the National Historic District, we'll be able to help interpret them a little bit more, and that helps us interpret what happens in our current district a little bit easier, especially like I said, like the Maryland campaign. The Valley becomes very important both in the movement to and from the Maryland campaign, the Gettysburg campaign. So it helps interpret a little bit more than just Stonewall Jackson in 1862, Newmarket in spring of 1864, and then 1864 Jubal Early versus Phil Sheridan.
Yeah.
It kind of expands the Valley's total Civil War history.
And that's
why I really enjoy studying the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley, is especially because I'm stationed up here in down here in Winchester. This is front lines every single day of the war. All these different campaigns that wage through the Valley, this area becomes important during that. So it's not like, oh, well, this is the campaign that makes this region important or makes this region famous. The Civil War just breathes in and out of the Shenandoah Valley, and that's why it's such a fun region to interpret the Civil War at.
Well, that's why I was asking, kind of like as you think interpretively, because, using Spotsylvania Courthouse as kind of a little mini example, the Park Service held a certain core part of the battlefield for so long and didn't hold other parts. And so that part of the story just didn't get told, and, fortunately, because of local preservation groups, the American Battlefield Trust, more of that's been put together. And so the story has rounded out more. And I could see there in the Valley where, we're at state line, got to stop. But the story doesn't stop. The state line didn't even exist in 1862. So kind of figuring how you guys have to deal with that as a challenge in order to tell that full story, even though you might not necessarily formally have boots on the ground. To me, it seems like that's still one of those things you kind of got to face as an elephant in the room.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head here, or hit the nail on the head there. We might not have boots on the ground at all of those major Civil War sites that encompass those three counties that hopefully will be joining our district, but you can't begin to talk. I mean, when we talk about the Civil War here in the Valley, you have to mention what's going on west of or east of the Blue Ridge Mountains. You have to mention what happens in West Virginia and all these other movements. And like I said, that's what makes the Valley, makes you appreciate it more, is when you figure out where it fits as a puzzle piece into the grand scheme of the Eastern Theater. And for so long, the Valley was interpreted as kind of this secondary theater. Like I said, 62 Jackson, 64 Newmarket, 64 Sheridan versus Jubal Early. And then it kind of becomes important, here and then. You hear its name every now and then in these bigger campaigns. But it really does figure prominently into those other movements outside of our district here. And being able to interpret how it plays into them helps us, like I said, expand the Civil War story here in the Valley. I mean, like you said, we can't just stop there at the state line there in West Virginia. So we are interpreting those sites and what happens in West Virginia's portion of the Shenandoah Valley, even before they're joining our National Historic District. So hopefully with them joining, it'll be a little bit easier, but we're not waiting for that to start, or we're not waiting for that to have us start, like I said, sinking our teeth in there and starting to talk about the American Civil War in West Virginia's portion of the Valley.
Now, as Jackson moves south, he escapes that pincer movement at Strasburg, and then he's going to head up the Valley. And Harrisonburg is kind of the next fight. We tend to skip that over, in large part because the battlefield's gone, except for here's the Ashby Monument and JMU.
Yeah. Although you do get a good idea from the Ashby Monument, that height that's out there on the battlefield. And then you can see the road beneath, so you can kind of get an idea of where the combat ensued. But yeah, it is a battlefield that kind of like First Winchester, I mean, that's entirely developed over. Well, you do have the Turner Ashby Monument out there. The Battle of Goods Farm, Chestnut Ridge. It's an interesting battle to sink into, especially because the Confederacy loses one of their first big heroes in the war at that battle, and that's Turner Ashby himself, who's buried right here in Winchester, Virginia. Ashby doesn't get talked about too much in the modern Civil War circles compared to what his legacy was during the war. While yes, Stuart falling eventually is a bigger cavalier to fall here in Virginia than Ashby was. But Ashby, especially before Jackson's death, that was a big loss to the Confederacy, especially here in Virginia. And that story of just, him, his horse gets is wounded underneath him. He apparently makes it like 6 steps away from his horse before he gets mortally wounded, and then his body is then brought to the Kemper House at Port Republic, and members of Ashby's cavalry ride by and they pay respects to his body as it's laying there in the window right in front of them. And you could walk up to that window today. That is today the Port Republic Museum, which is preserved by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. So, like I said, that's an interesting battle. Although it can be hard to envision it with all the development. You do get some good view sheds out there, depending what time of year you're out there. That kind of help you piece the story together a little bit. And with the Turner Ashby Monument, it at least marks the location where one of the Confederacy's most famous leaders falls early on in the war.
And it's a little bit ironic, because the whole Ashby Cavalry situation, which is worthy of a podcast of its own, like that's a hot mess. That's a hot mess. The public's like, "Oh, this guy's awesome," and when in the army, it's like, "Oh my gosh, these guys aren't doing their job. These guys don't have any discipline."
They've grown to the 7th Virginia Cavalry grows to be almost brigade sized at one point.
They're huge,
and Jackson doesn't know what to do with it. And it's funny because that's kind of Jackson's relationship with a lot of his subordinates, where he might not have a good relationship with them face to face, but he has that trust in them, and he kind of has that trust in Ashby, although Ashby and Jackson did kind of butt heads a few times. And there's a lot of times, especially here in the lower end of the valley, where Ashby doesn't necessarily perform on his best. His faulty intelligence that leads to First Kernstown, and then his failure to pursue and bag Banks after First Winchester. That definitely does kind of play into Jackson versus Ashby's little kind of, like I said, legacy. But yeah, the 7th Cav here in Virginia, that's a whole interesting story. And Ashby's Cavalry Command really are an interesting aspect of Jackson in 1862. And like you said, the public are there like, this is the Black Knight of the Valley, this dashing general. But within the Army, especially within Jackson and his officer corps, oh my goodness, that Ashby's cavalry were a thorn in his side, at least logistically were.
Yeah. I thought Flournoy did a better job overall than Ashby did, but with the 6th, but oops, can't say that. Can't say that out loud. So then we get down to Cross Keys and Port Republic. And I'll be honest, like those are the battlefields I have the toughest time wrapping my head around. Just when I get down there, the topography, the orientation. Tell me about your experience with those 2 battlefields, which kind of culminate the Valley campaign.
When I first studied those battlefields, or the first time I really read it into any text that was more than just a summary of the campaign, I read Crick's Conquering the Valley. And for Port Republic, it was a lot easier for me to envision that battlefield. I mean, usually if I'm reading up on a battlefield that I haven't visited to yet, I will go and I'll go onto Google Earth and I'll get a good idea of some of these locations. And Port Republic was a little bit easier for me to envision. I mean, you have the small hand, and then when you get your feet on the ground there, it's like, okay, that's exactly how my brain pictured it. Port Republic, the rivers, the River Plain, Lewiston Lane, the coaling, it's all right there, just kind of how it looks exactly in the maps. Cross Keys is a lot harder to interpret if you haven't been out there to the field yet. And first time I read it through Conquering the Valley, it was a little hard for me to wrap my head around why these movements are taking place, just because I didn't have an idea of what the terrain really looked like there. And this is one battlefield that I talk about frequently with guests who have come in and out of the valley, who do like their yearly trips out here. And the one battlefield, I mean, not the one, but one that I seem to get comments on a lot that has just the visitor experience has gotten so much better at recently has been Cross Keys, because I picked up those old tour maps and tour brochures for the Shenandoah Valley from even just 20 years ago or 35 years ago. I've got stuff from the early 90s that says, yeah, well, drive through Cross Keys and pull over at this mile marker and across that field, down in that ravine where the trees are in the distance. That's where some of the action took place. It's like 2 miles in the distance, but yeah, that's where it was. And you go from that to what we've been able to do with Cross Keys, where a lot of those grounds are now open to the general public. There's now trail systems out there. A number of interpretive markers have been added to Cross Keys and Port Republic within the last few years. Like I said, those the monuments have been added. So much better idea of that position out there, the position that Milroy's trying to take. And going back to, I mean, when we were talking about appreciating these battlefields and appreciating the stories on them a little bit more. Cross Keys, the example of the 8th New York out there, that is like the shining example here in the Valley. You read about it, and it just talks about this unit marching right into the teeth of these guns, and they get nearly slaughtered out there, decimated. And you stand out there. I always recommend, if you go to Cross Keys, at least bring somebody else, and split up when you get to the Widow Pence farm site where the slaughter of the 8th New York took place. Have somebody stand in the Confederate position, have somebody make the Union advance, and they pop the 8th New York pops out, their heads pop out right in front of you, right in front of where the Confederate guns would be. And it's kind of like, for our listeners, I'm sure if you travel around the Eastern Theater battlefields, I'm sure you guys have been to the Antietam National Battlefield. It's kind of like the Bloody Lane out there, where the ground kind of just spits the troops out right in front of that position. That's very much what the Widow Pence farm site is. And like I said, going out there with 2 people, you get a big appreciation to the New Yorkers who just walked right into these Confederate guns, these Georgians and Mississippians. And then you get a great appreciation, not only for that, but for some of the storytelling of the Shenandoah Valley. These were Dutch New Yorkers, and the Dutch soldiers here in the Shenandoah Valley, by this time in the war, had a pretty rough reputation. They were considered to be rough on the Confederate populace here. They were considered to be some of the harsher soldiers towards the Confederate civilians here in the Valley. So when the 8th New York gets, like I said, nearly decimated out there at the Widow Pence farm, there's reports from the Confederates that this was needed retribution for the Dutch soldiers' actions here in the Shenandoah Valley. You can tell a little bit more about just the human interest side of things in 1862 in the Valley, just from that little action out there. So that is a amazing property to go ahead and check out, that is now preserved by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, and it's accessible to the general public. And going back to going to see these battlefields and stuff, I completely forgot to mention, going in the beginning of this podcast, we have a series of Unigrid maps, of maps that tell you where to pull over to really get the best tour of these battlefields. So we currently have Unigrid maps made up for Winchester battlefields, which encompasses the 6 battles in Winchester. We have Unigrid maps that are available for Harrisonburg, Cross Keys, Port Republic, Newmarket. So if you go to any of our museums and visitor centers and you ask, or if you go to any of our partner visitor centers, the ones that we have our orientations panels at, you can go there and request a Unigrid map for some of these battlefields, and that will help navigate you to these sites. So going back to Cross Keys, now having that map, it makes it easier for the guests to go through the battlefields in sequence. And especially with Port Republic Cross Keys, it's really interesting to talk about sequence, because it starts with Jackson's narrow escape in Port Republic, then Cross Keys, then back in Port Republic for the battle. But going back to the terrain, you get a great appreciation for what the soldiers experienced on that ground, especially from the Widow Pence farm, which for generations since the Civil War has never been accessible to the general public. For us to go out there and to talk about that action, it was always out there in the distance. Well, now, because of the efforts of Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, the general public, can go out there and experience these locations. So that's, like I said, one of the shining examples here where the story can really be told in full now that that ground is open to the public.
And I think similarly, being able to kind of be at the coaling at Port Republic, and that, like you said, is an easier battle to envision, because river, railroad, floodplain, river plain, and then the hill, which sort of sits kind of at the corner of the federal position. But boy, what an important piece of ground that really kind of, lets you see and understand the whole story.
It commands the battlefield. Standing upon the coaling, and we've added, I think it was 10 new interpretive markers.
Which are great, by the way. I was just out there. They are fantastic. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, those are great because, the coaling is such an important location when it comes to hell spots here in the Shenandoah Valley. The Civil War enthusiast community, we love to talk about one part of the battlefield that just becomes the focal point. And it's easy in the years after the war, and especially these last few decades, for us to say, okay, well, let's put attention to these lesser known areas of the battlefield. But there's usually a reason why there was a focus on that hell spot. There's a reason. We can argue that the Hornet's Nest was not the most important section of Shiloh, but there's a reason why the Hornet's Nest became so infamous. going, Little Round Top. I'm more of a Culp's Hill kind of guy myself, but there's a reason why we talk a lot about Little Round Top when you go out to Gettysburg today. And same thing with the coaling. It is the position that absolutely commands Port Republic. And there's a lot of troops that fight upon that ground. Two of the most famous Confederate units in the war fight upon that ground. Portions of the Stonewall Brigade are first dispatched to try and take the coaling, and then they're pushed off. They then are kind of pushed into the, dispatched into the River Plain. And then you have Taylor's Louisiana Brigade. I'm going to add a little footnote right here because I have to add it every single time I'm talking. I'm a graduate of the University of Mississippi. I'm an Ole Miss graduate. So I'm not a big fan of the Louisiana Tigers. Not an LSU fan, but I'll give them their props this month. My little cousin just graduated from LSU.
Oh,
so
okay.
the Tigers, yeah, that's one of the locations where they really do make their name. And Robideau Wheat, he's got the famous story of him slashing the horses' throats upon the coaling there. That's such an impressive location, just from the back and forth, tooth and nail, and then just the vivid descriptions of the carnage that littered that hillside in the aftermath of that fight. That is the focal point of Port Republic without any doubt. And if you go to Port Republic and you miss that site, you really did not experience the battlefield. You go out there to the coaling and, like you said, get to read those new interpretive markers that really do paint the picture for the combat there in front of you. You can see basically majority of that battlefield. And then you also get to stand at the location where this heavy action took place. And like I said earlier, in terms of hell spots here in the Shenandoah Valley, that's probably up there as one of the top 2 hell spots here in our National Historic District. Middlefield at 3rd Winchester might have an argument with that. Fort Collier at 3rd Winchester might have an argument with that as well. But the coaling definitely is up there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and for me, it's kind of interesting, I being in Spotsylvania and, I'm just out there today, giving a tour to some folks and, so many of those Louisiana units that are fighting out there in the valley, which do just incredible work. Like they meet their end at Spotsy because they, get swept up.
Yeah.
And so it's really been kind of neat. I spend so much time with them in their last days to have spent time out in the valley and just kind of see them at their full glory. And, they are Jackson's hammer through most of the valley, and you get to walk on so much of that ground.
And what's cool is you always hear about the Louisiana Tigers being the shock troops, and you really do see that use here in the Valley. Let's take 1st Winchester, for example. They absolutely are the shock troops there. While the Stonewall Brigade is the ones that are first deployed to Bowers Hill, they'll take that initial ridge, and you have the other Virginia brigades will deploy west from there. Taylor's men then move, like I said, to the western side of Bowers Hill, and they'll be the ones to initiate that charge onto Bowers Hill. When they're about halfway up the hill is when the rest of the Virginians will join up in that charge, and it becomes a big 1-2 punch. The one of that 1-2 punch being the Louisiana Tigers. And then once again, going to Port Republic, while Stonewall Brigade is the first troops to be kind of dispatched to the coaling, it's the Tigers that are the ones that are sent out there to really make that into the heavy fight of the battlefield. And like I said, Robideau Wheat, the stories of him slashing the horses definitely do add to the horror aspect of the coaling at Port Republic. But even just, that battlefield alone, we have 2 active projects. One of the big ones is adding a trail adjacent to the coaling. So we currently have over 760 acres preserved there at Port Republic, with 172 acres that are actively in project. So as of right now, we have over 2,835 acres preserved from the 1862 Shenandoah Valley campaign with Stonewall Jackson, and over 450 acres are in the process that are in, like I said, in projects right now to join or to at least be added to that acreage total. So like I said, over 2,800 acres preserved by the Battlefields Foundation here in the district associated with 1862, 450 being added in the near future. So stories where we're talking about right now, where these famous troops fight upon, and not even 1862. We were mentioning the Tigers. Go to the Second Battle of Winchester, where they attack and capture West Fort. We've been able to preserve that ground as well. So many of these units, their legacies do endure, even right here in the Shenandoah Valley, even after Jackson falls. So being able to preserve land, not just from Jackson's campaign, but from the Gettysburg campaign, the 64 campaigns as well. That's what our goal is here in the Valley, and being able to interpret it and during events just like this right here.
So let me ask you 2 final questions here. First of all,
Yeah.
if someone wants to financially or otherwise contribute to what you guys are up to help with these preservation efforts, how could they do that?
Well, the best way to support us is, becoming a member of the Battlefields Foundation is the easiest way to support us. You can become a member through our website. If you go to Shenandoah at War, that's our website. You can learn a little bit more about the district, what sites there are to see, what museums, visitor centers there are to see, what battlefields there are, points of interest. But there's also a membership tab in there, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the membership. You get a subscription to the Shenandoah at War magazine. You get admissions waived at all of our battlefield locations that we preserve here in the that we maintain here in the Shenandoah Valley, which includes all of our museums and visitor centers for you and your household for the next year. So that's included with it. You get regular updates on battlefield preservation here in the Shenandoah Valley, and you also support what we're doing here, the preservation, saving hallowed grounds where American blood, North and South, has been shed upon for future generations to go ahead and explore. But not only that, but maintaining those grounds that we already have, and then adding interpretation in the form of wayside markers. And like I said, programs like this podcast right here, to field trips, bringing those to our locations. When you become a member of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, you're supporting Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation as a whole, and our main goal of preserving, maintaining, and interpreting these Civil War sites here in the National Historic District. So you can become a member through our website, or if you want to help support a specific project, like I said, with the 62 Valley campaign alone, we have over 450 acres of projects, there are parcels that projects are taking place on right now, just associated with the campaign that we were talking about today. If any of these interest you, you can always call up our main office reach to our donor relations. And like I said, put some money in for some of these projects particularly, or if you want to just support the foundation as a whole, the best way to do that is become a member. You can do that through our website, or you can call the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. Our contact information is also available there at the website, Shenandoah at War. So like I said, the best way to support Civil War preservation here in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, support the Battlefields Foundation by either becoming a member or donating to any of our projects. And then even on top of that, if you follow and you keep in touch with the Battlefields Foundation through social media, that also helps out. Reposting our stuff on social media helps put the word about who we are to the rest of the Civil War community. I mean, Chris, I appreciate you having us on just for this right here, because this will help us kind of get the word out there a little bit more about who we are. We're a pretty young organization. And within this last 25 plus years, 26 plus years, we've been able to save a lot of hallowed grounds here in the Shenandoah Valley, not just battlefield locations, but buildings associated with the war. And then adding, like I said, the interpretation to really build the experience there. If you want to be part of that winning team here in the Shenandoah Valley and really turn this location into a Civil War destination, best way to do that is to support the Battlefields Foundation by becoming a member or by donating to any of our projects, or just supporting the foundation through social media. So there's a lot of ways that you can support us. We hope that the listeners decide to sometime in the near future.
Sure. So my final question, and you talk about the Valley being a destination, which it is well worth people's time to visit. Any final tips you would offer folks as they want to come and explore the 1862 battlefields?
Like I said, your best bet would start, I would recommend starting, don't do it in sequence. You're going to be driving back and forth a few times if that's the case. A lot of people, when they do a campaign, they want to do it in sequence. And it was easy for me when I was living in North Mississippi to do like the Vicksburg stuff, because I kind of make my route, those different routes to Vicksburg. It's harder here in the Shenandoah Valley, especially with Jackson's campaign, because it kind of bounces back and forth a little bit. And it encompasses a large stretch of ground. Like you were mentioning earlier, that drive out to McDowell is a serious one. So I would say your best bet would be, I would say start top and go down, or top and go up south. So start with Winchester, the Shenandoah Valley Civil War Museum, the 1840 Winchester, or the Frederick County Courthouse right here in downtown Winchester, Virginia. That's a crown jewel of Civil War history. I gave my whole spiel about that. That's a good location to kind of orient you at the Shenandoah Valley itself. And then that's associated with the First Battle of Winchester. You can also pick up all of those Unigrid maps I was mentioning earlier from that location. So our district-wide map, our Winchester Battlefields map, our Harrisonburg, Cross Keys, Port Republic, Newmarket battlefield maps. You pick all those ones up there. And then you can ask the staff who's on location, the staff or volunteers, about any of the other Civil War sites in the area, or just associated with the Valley the 62 Valley campaign, and they'll be able to kind of steer you in the right direction. Then you can walk around downtown Winchester, see where Jackson rode through after First Winchester, drive south. you drive around Hanley High School, get a good idea of First Winchester, drive further south, see First Kernstown. Whether you associate that with the 62 with Jackson's Valley campaign formally or not, it's worth going to see what they're doing out there at the Kernstown Battlefield Association. Then you can continue even further south. You could stop at Newmarket, get a good view of you go visit Strayer House, a building that was twice occupied by Stonewall Jackson during the war. And that's where he makes that famous movement into the Newmarket Gap towards Front Royal and First Winchester. So you can get a good idea of not a battlefield location, but a moment of the campaign right there. Then make the trek out to Highland County, see McDowell, see the Highland County Museum out there. And then you can come back into the main portion of the Shenandoah Valley, go check out Harrisonburg, Cross Keys, Port Republic, go visit the Hardesty Higgins Visitor Center out there in Harrisonburg to get a good idea of what happens out in Harrisonburg, the Port Republic Museum and the historic Kemper House at Port Republic. And from right there, you have a good idea of the Jackson Valley campaign. And there's many other sites you can go visit on top of that, the Miller Kite House. There's a list of stuff that we could put on top of this, but that's what I would probably focus on if you're going to make a 62 Valley campaign tour. Start from the lower end of the Shenandoah Valley, work your way up south through the valley, and see the sites as you come across them from there. Especially if you're going to follow Jackson's campaign, don't do it in sequence, but start with Winchester. It becomes a good orientation for the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley, and then as you drive deeper into the valley, you can see some more interesting battlefields.
All right. Mike, I appreciate your insight into helping us explore this terrain and this story and these battlefields. It's a wonderful resource, and the work that you guys are doing at the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, so important in telling this and so many other of those stories in the valley. So thanks so much for spending some time with us today.
Of course. And once again, I appreciate you for having us on. Chris, I'm a big fan of yours personally. Jackson's a big reason why I came out here, and I know you're a big Jackson fan. You got a lot of great texts on him. So I read them when I was in college, and even since I've been working with the Battlefields Foundation. So being able to talk to you in this setting on a personal level is really, really fun. And then just being able to plug in the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation to the emerging Civil War community. It's a big honor. I love what I get to do with the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, from a day in, day out tasks to being able to be an ambassador for what we do to the Valley on podcasts and events just like this one right here. So I hope to come back and maybe we can talk about 1863 and 1864 in a future episode. But for right now, come see the Shenandoah Valley. Come see the sites associated with Jackson's fabled Valley campaign of 1862. The only place you can do that is by coming to visit the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District. So we hope to see you here in the Shenandoah Valley sometime soon.
Thanks so much. Mike Gionfriddo from the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. Thanks for being with us. I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War Podcast. Thank you so much. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.